We are in this series called In the Wilderness, and talking about how God meets his people in their wilderness, in their times of trouble and desolation, in their times of just feeling like maybe you're lost or you're wandering. God meets us there and transforms it into a place where he can do great things in us. A place where he can call us, where he can lead us, he can strengthen us. Even while we are still struggling, God does all of that for us. And today's passage is no different. Last week we talked about Moses in his wilderness and how God called him out of that wilderness to be a leader, to be a person who is on mission with God. And today we see that Israel, the entire nation, is going to go into a wilderness, but through that, God is going to lead them during the journey in their wilderness. So follow along, Exodus chapter 13. We're going to read verses 18 through 22, and then Exodus 40 is where we're going to end up. So Exodus 13 first, starting in verse 18. So he led the people around towards the Red Sea along the road of the wilderness. And the Israelites left the land of Egypt in battle formation. And Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made the Israelites swear a solemn oath saying, God will certainly come to your aid. Then you must take my bones with you from this place. They set out from Succoth and camped at Etham on the edge of the wilderness. And the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to lead them on their way during the day, and in a pillar of fire to give them light at night so they could travel day or night. And the pillar of cloud by day, the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. Now Exodus chapter 40, the very end of it, starting in verse 34. So this is kind of the bookend of the whole story of Exodus. Says, the cloud covered the tent of meeting. The glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was unable to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud rested on it. And the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. The Israelites set out whenever the cloud was taken up from the tabernacle throughout all the stages of their journey. If the cloud was not taken up, they did not set out until the day it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and there was a fire inside the cloud by night, visible to the entire house of Israel throughout all the stages of their journey. As I was thinking about this is the journey in the wilderness. And who better to study on the journey in the wilderness than the Israelites? After all, they spent the most time, it seems like, in the wilderness, wandering around, feeling like they may be lost, but yet we read here in Exodus that God was the one who was leading them on this journey. That the wilderness was not a place where they were left alone, but it was the place where God was with them. And I know sometimes in our struggles, in our battles, in the moments, different seasons of our lives, we feel like we're the only ones going through this. But God is with you. God is the one who's going to lead you through this. I came across a tagline that it seemed appropriate for this study, for this series, and especially for this message today. The tagline of the movie just says this: sometimes you have to lose your way to get back home. Sometimes we have to take the long way around. Sometimes we have to go through different seasons to get us to where we're at the right place at the right time. But God is always there. Israel had just been set free from Egypt after 430 years. 430 years they were there. And now this is a very large nation of nomads, of people just, they didn't have a home. They didn't have a place to belong. They had nothing except for what they took with them out of Egypt, which that's a whole nother study. And that's a great little side note there. If you don't know what they took with them into the wilderness, go back and read that. That's a great point of what God does to prepare them for the wilderness. But the journey through the wilderness is one that we need to understand. Because as we go through our own wilderness, as we go through our own times of struggles, of confusion, we need to understand that God is still there with us. See, God was the one who set the Israelites free. God was one who provided them with this opportunity. I bet you didn't think of your wilderness as an opportunity, did you? You may be in a wilderness experience right now and you're probably thinking like, opportunity, this is not an opportunity. This is the exact opposite. Whatever the opposite of opportunity is, that's what this is. But God was the one who also had a plan to give them a home, to give them a place to belong. But how to get to that, they had to go through the wilderness. They had to go through this time. It was interesting in verse 17, we actually read this of chapter 13, that God was the one who did not lead them along the road of the land, but led them into the wilderness. And God said that he did this on purpose because the people will change their minds if it was too easy. If it was the easy road to get to where they were wanting to go, the people would not have trusted God. They would not have followed God. So God had to lead them into the wilderness. There was actually 3 major highways or trade routes out of Egypt that could have taken the Israelites to where they needed to go, to the promised land, to the place that they would call home. The 3 different trade routes would have taken them, and it would have been a much easier route than the route that they chose, but they took option number 4. Not door number 1, not door number 2, not door number 3, that were all easy. No, we're going to take option number 4, none of the above. And it was that way that they were going to see God at work. If they took the easy route, if they took the easy road, easy street, they wouldn't have been able to really know God and love him. It actually would have ended up bad for them. Because those easy streets were also the streets that were full of robbers and thieves, con artists that would have taken advantage of them. You got to remember, these people had just come from generations of being slaves. They did not make a decision for themselves. Not what to eat, not what to wear, not when to work. That was all decided by the Egyptians. So now this brand new nation of people, if they were wandering the easy streets, they would have been taken full advantage of. They would have been robbed blind of everything that God had just given them. Reminds me of a quote from the great football mind, John Madden. He said this: "The road to Easy Street goes through the sewers." Yeah, it would have been the easy route to get there. And those routes, it would have only taken them about 2 weeks to get to the promised land, but instead they had to go the long way of 40 years. But you know, there's never been a meaningful life that was built on Easy Street. There's never been a time when the Easy Street way of doing things was the best. Yeah, maybe the most comfortable, meaning that we don't face hardships, but then we become lazy if we live on easy street. Now, you got to be careful because some of you may actually live on a street called easy. Those do exist, but I'm talking about the concept, the idea that the American life needs to be lived on the easy street. And that's not very smart. That's not very wise. And God knew this, and so God took them on the road of the wilderness on purpose. Sometimes we think about this, and I've even done this myself. God, why? As we're facing hardships, as we're facing trials, as we're facing difficulties, and we're facing times where we don't understand what is going on or even what to do next, and we will cry out, God, why? But God is one who leads us to the wilderness on purpose. Because the journey through the wilderness creates a deeper relationship with our God. As we start going through those difficult times, we start relying on God's instructions and God's leadership. And that's the first lesson here about going through the wilderness, our journey through the wilderness. I loved how several places in the scripture we read, it actually said the journey through the wilderness that the Israelites took. This was where they got to experience God's leadership. And we need to trust God's leadership. We need to understand God's leadership. That this wilderness path that may have never been taken before was not a mistake. It was God's plan all along. God doesn't make mistakes with us. Yes, circumstances, yes, the enemy may try to ruin those ideas that God has, but God will always overcome, and God will always use it to bring us to the point that God will turn all things to good to those who trust Him, to those who are obedient to Him. And so the Israelites need to experience this in order to build that trust. In order to build the relationship with their God, they needed to go through the wilderness. And that wilderness path was just like what God did with Moses that we studied last week. A lot of it was so that God could get their attention. That God could get their full, undivided attention, because when there's nothing else to look at, when there's nothing else to distract, they only got to listen to God. They only got to experience God up there. So just as with Moses, it's interesting here that the Israelites got to see God, and God revealed Himself in a unique way. This cloud by day and fire by night. It's interesting that it starts off, the Exodus journey started off, and God says, here's how I'm going to lead you. A cloud by day and a fire by night. And then Exodus chapter 40, it says, and this is how it ended. God was still doing that at the very end of Exodus. A cloud by day and a fire by night. This was the presence of God with the people. God revealed Himself in a visible way. This was not just some symbolic phrase or some idea retelling of the story. This was a literal phenomenon that happened, that throughout the entire wilderness journey, God would appear to the people visibly as a cloud by day and a fire by night. I love this imagery because there are so many layers to this. They're going through the wilderness, which is another way of saying they're going through a desert. They're going through barren land. And if you've ever been in the desert, during the day, what happens in the desert? it gets scorching hot. It gets terrible. The sun is beating down on you and there's no shade anywhere to escape. So what does God do? God says, I've got you covered. Literally. I've got you covered. Walk in my shadow. Walk in my presence. And then what happens at night in the desert? Have any of you ever been in the desert at night? It gets cold. How it goes from 120 down to, freezing temperatures, it feels like. It's not because Mother Nature has gotten off of her meds. It's because the desert is just that kind of territory. And so what do they need to stay warm but a fire? A supernatural fire that provides them warmth, provides them light, so that they can walk, whether in the middle of the day or at night. Sometimes if you're journeying through the desert, going at night is the best option, because the heat gets too bad, and so finding shelter. But it's amazing how God revealed himself to the Israelites in this way. Again, it seems so simple when we read it. Of course, a cloud by day and a fire by night. No, there's a lot to that. God's meeting needs that they didn't even know that they had yet. God's protecting them and covering them in ways that they couldn't imagine. And so the presence of God was what was leading them through the wilderness. Boy, don't you wish in your wilderness experience, in your time of struggle, you had a visible showing of where to go, which way to go, instead of trying to say, I wish I should have taken a left at Albuquerque. That's what Bugs Bunny always said was, I missed that left at Albuquerque. No, if we had a visible sign of God, we would know exactly where to go. But that's not the point. See, the people didn't even know where they were going. They didn't know the destination. They just knew that they needed to be in the presence of God to follow his leading. God's leadership in the desert, in the wilderness, is what is actually beautiful in this moment. That God, and chapter 40 said this, that God dwelled with his people in the wilderness. God was present with them in their struggles, in their wandering. And that is a beautiful picture of that we need to remember sometimes in our wilderness, in our time of desperation. We need to remember that God is there with us, leading us, and he will lead us. He will direct our paths to righteousness for his namesake. But we need to see God's leadership. We also need to realize that Israel had a part in all this. They had to be obedient. Israel's obedience in the wilderness is something to focus on and get it, that this is from Exodus 13 to Exodus 40 is a long story with a lot of things happening in the middle of all this. But from beginning to end, we need to see that Israel, the one thing that they were supposed to do during all this was just be obedient. Follow God in the wilderness. See, if God led them to the wilderness on purpose, for a reason, the people had to follow God in order to experience his presence with them. Israel, going back to, they'd just been released. This is day one of being free people after generations of slavery. So Israel was dependent upon Egypt for every little thing throughout their day. Everything about their predictable way of life, their daily routine, was now gone. They didn't know what they were going to do for food or water. They didn't know their left from their right. They had not been out of Egypt. So what were they going to do? They had nothing else to do except for follow God. Rely on God. Be obedient. Be walking in His presence. Again, the imagery of God providing the cloud by day and the fire by night is, if you stepped outside of the following God, you would suffer. If you remained present with God, you were covered. And Israel had to go through that. What would they do now that they were free? What would they do? They only had one option: follow God. Well, where would they go? Where would they call home? They only had one option at this point: follow God. They had no goals, no objectives, no direction, except follow God. Starting to get the picture yet? We, in our wilderness, need to follow God. Now, Israel had to do a few things in order to follow God in their wilderness. First of all, they had to trust God. They had to trust God. This God that they heard about from their forefathers of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They heard the stories of how God led Abraham through his wilderness experience. How God provided in all these things. They knew the stories of how God used Joseph to save his family. But yet, for generations now, 400 years, they had not experienced the ability to follow God. They didn't even really have a relationship with God at this point, other than they cried out. And it seemed like their prayers were going unanswered until this guy named Moses shows up. And he says, follow me as I follow God, and I'm going to lead you out to the middle of nowhere. Sounds like a good idea, huh? So the people followed blindly almost. But this was the point, was they had to learn to trust God. God had so many reasons to lead them into the wilderness. To lead them in this journey. And God wanted to teach them so many key lessons. And the first one was, there's more important things than just getting from point A to point B. I remember a story of a grandfather taking his grandson out to the fence line. Probably had as much property as Bill did. Taking him to the back fence line and of course the grandfather was determined. He had a reason to go back there. Probably to repair the fence, because the fence is always breaking down. Probably another cow got out. But the grandfather was determined. He was focused. He was walking in that, and he was going through, and it was kind of like this. It was a snowy day, and you could see the footprints. And the grandfather's footprints were a straight line from point A to point B. Of course, the grandsons, grandsons, they're all over the place. Man, they're climbing up this hill. They're looking down at this ravine here. They're going over there and exploring where they thought they saw a squirrel, or maybe that was just the squirrels in their head. But the grandfather says, now, once they got there, the grandfather said, now I want you to turn around and look back. Look at my footprints. They're straight line. Now look at your footprints. They're all over the place. And the grandson, probably not the smartest move, but he said, yeah, but think about all the things you missed, Grandpa. If we're so focused on getting from point A to point B, we may miss moments with God. We may miss the moments with other people. The wilderness experience was actually beneficial for Israel to become a nation together. If they had lost all their identity, all their purpose from being set free, this was a time where God was going to remind them and reinstall in them who they were. That they were God's chosen people to be a blessing to the world. And so they had to learn to trust God. They had to trust the wisdom of God. Even though it made no sense, the direction that they were going. And I've seen so many of them, I can imagine out there, the Israelites walking, and they're just walking and walking. And they're like, didn't we pass that bush last year? Wait, this looks familiar. Because we've been here before. But they had to trust the wisdom of God. And even though it made no sense, and in our wilderness experience, it's hard for us to make sense of what's happening. We don't know the outcome of our struggles, of our time when it seems like we're lost, but yet God is the one leading us home. God's ways are not our ways. And so we have to trust God. God knows what He's doing, and He is going to lead us. Another story is a brother was leading his sister up the mountaintop because he wanted her to experience the view. If any of you have ever been on a mountaintop, you know sometimes that view, just looking over a valley, is beautiful. It's something that you can't describe, you have to experience. And so the brother was saying, you know what, I'll take my sister up there, my little sister. And bigger brothers, aren't always the greatest leaders of little sisters. But the sister was like, as they were going up, the brother was leading, and the sister said, this is no path at all. There's no clear direction. You're taking me through brush and shrubbery. There's no easy path up here. And the brother said, yes, there is. This is the path, because all these rocks, all these bumps that you were complaining about is what's getting you to the top. That's your sure footing. That's where you have to take that step. And we have to trust that God is leading us, even though it may be a bumpy ride, He's leading us to the place where we get to see Him in a whole new way. But not only do we need to trust God, trust His leadership, but Israel had to believe in the promises of God. That Israel was going to believe the very thing that God had said way back in Genesis chapter 12. God made a promise to this guy named Abraham that He was going to make him a great nation, and that the place where he was standing, where Abraham was standing, was going to be given to his ancestors, to his descendants. That Abraham's descendants were going to inhabit the land that he was standing on. And they had to believe that promise from generations ago. That God was a God who kept His word. And that Israel now was going to benefit from the promises made long ago. But they had to go through the wilderness to get to that point. They had to go on a journey. They had to walk those paths that weren't clear at times, but they had to go through the wilderness to get there. I love the story here it's a small story, it's a sub-story. You may have missed it, but it's interesting to me. So Moses is leading the Israelites out of Egypt, and Moses has to stop and dig up a grave and carry the bones of Joseph with him. Because Joseph made the Israelites promise that he was going to be taken with them to the promised land. Now, if you think about this, it's interesting. Joseph had a good life in Egypt. He was the second in command. He was basically the ruler over all of Egypt. He experienced wealth. He experienced blessings because God was the one who led them there. That's a whole nother story, a whole nother sermon series even. But Joseph had a good life in Egypt, but then he said, but that's not good enough because God has something better. I'm going to leave the good life to go experience the presence of God, even if it is in the wilderness. And so Joseph believed this, and he made them promise to carry his bones. See, God is in the promise-keeping business. So the promises of God that we read in Scripture, God will keep them forever. And those promises that are made, there's many of them that we are the ones who benefit from. Israel, even though they weren't there when the promises were made, were the ones who were going to get the blessing from that promise. To see the fulfillment come true through them and for them. So we need to believe in the promises of God that He has already made, even in our wilderness journey. And so in your wilderness journey, maybe you need to go back and look at some of the promises of God. And say, God, I believe that you are going to keep your promises. That you are going to be with me. That you will never leave me. That you won't abandon me. But that you're going to make me a blessing to others, even in my struggle. But not only did Israel, not only do we have to trust God, not only do we have to believe in the promises of God, but Israel had to rest in His presence. Again, there was a small little thing here. In chapter 40, it says that if the cloud was not taken up during the day, they would not move. They would not set out until the cloud moved again. We need to rest in God's presence. Not only did God provide the cloud by day, the fire by night, throughout this 40-year journey of getting to the promised land, but God provided rest for them regularly. Now, it doesn't say specifically in here, but I could take a very educated guess on how many days that they rested throughout their 40-year journey. Probably every 7 days. It's called the Sabbath. A day of rest, a day of worship, a day to reconnect with others around you. It is a day meant for God, provided by God. And I love what Scripture says, that Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. See, the Sabbath is something beneficial to us. Not something we're supposed to begrudgingly do and obey, but it actually is for our benefit. And so we need to rest in the presence of God. We need to have a regular time of resting in the presence of God, and Israel needed to experience this. It's different than just a day off. I don't know about any of you, but my day off is a day where I do more chores. Because I'm not doing my job, but now I'm doing my honey-do list. My girls actually they bought a dry erase board and they put it out in the garage to where I could see it. This is the daddy-do list. So I had to fix doorknobs and light bulbs, and on my days off, I had to do things. A Sabbath isn't just a day off. It is a day of intentionality to rest and to reconnect. It's a time of rediscovering who God is and building relationships with each other. Israel experienced this throughout their wilderness journey because they had to follow God's lead. And God took every seventh day and rested. Did God need it? No. But Israel did. It reminds me of a story about the Oregon Trail. You know the video game where everyone dies from dysentery? Oh, no. The actual Oregon Trail. 1850s. Where people are leaving the Kansas, Missouri area, and they're traveling by covered wagon to the new territory of Oregon. This one group, every group that was traveling would elect a leader. This one group decided they were going to elect a pastor to be their leader on the Oregon Trail. Again, who does this? I don't know. But they did. They elected a pastor. And so they set out on their journey. And one Saturday night, the first Saturday night of their trip, the leader, the pastor, decided to announce, tomorrow we are not moving from this place. We're going to take Sunday and rest. Well, this angered some of the people because they only had a few months to get from Missouri to Oregon. And they were only traveling about 15 to 20 miles a day at most. And so if we take every seventh day and rested, we're losing valuable time. And so some of the group decided to split off. And they left and they said, we're going to travel every single day. And pretty soon, a few weeks later, the group that rested came across all the dead animals from the other group that were pushed too hard. And then a few weeks later, they started seeing that there were signs that even the men of the group were not able to travel as hard as that group that was trying to push. But their men were very rested because they took that seventh day, that Sabbath day, to rest and reconnect. Long story short, the group that took the Sabbath got there before the group that was pushing all the way through. Not only did they get there faster, but the group was more united. They liked each other still. They wanted to be a community because every seventh day, they worshiped, they sang songs, they played games, and they just were present with each other. They learned to rest in the presence of God. So in conclusion, I want you to think about this. The journey through the wilderness teaches us that we need to follow God. We have no other choices but to follow God. Sure, we can come up with our plans, but if God's not in it, I don't want to go that way. So we need to follow God. And the real question for us today is, are we desperate for the very presence of God in our journey? So desperate for the presence of God that if we don't see God moving, we're not going to move. If God's not leading, I'm not going to take a chance outside the presence of God to do anything. So the journey through the wilderness, yes, I get it. Israel was not always the greatest example of being obedient or responsive to the presence of God. But when they made the mistakes of moving without God, they suffered for it. And I don't want to see you, I don't want for myself or my family, I don't want to experience the suffering of moving or doing anything without the presence of God. So again, let me say the question once more. Are we desperate enough for the presence of God to move when He moves, to rest when He rests? Is that what we want? God's going to lead us through our wilderness, but He wants to remind us that we are dependent upon Him. So the wilderness is not a place of abandonment, of loneliness, but it's a place where we get to experience God in a whole new way, as He cares for us, as He provides for us.